Thank you so much. Sorry?
Do you mind recording?
No, that's okay. Sure. Thank you so much. Yeah, I'm happy to talk today about epistemic data. So the ideas I'm going to present today are something like a picture that is already accepted, and some new ideas I have on epistemic blame. And I basically try to apply what I said in this paper to the debate on epistemic blame and see where it leads me and us. And basically, I will be concerned with. Oh, no, it doesn't work. So maybe I just press the button. Oh, it doesn't work. Okay. Oh, yeah, now it works. Good. So the puzzle of epistemic blame. So Cameron Bowles spells this out in his new book manuscript, and this is my own version, but it's very close. First, it's a connection of three claims that lead to a contradiction. So it's.
It seems like can't hear you very well.
Can't hear you. Can't hear me. Sorry.
Or maybe take off the mask.
Yeah. Is it okay if I take off?
Yeah.
So sorry. Can you hear me?
You need to speak closer to the mic. It's not that we don't hear you because there's bad connection. It's because you're too far away from the mic, so it just gives some, it resonates. So that's why.
Okay, I don't understand you very well. But can you hear me better now? Or maybe we might just move the camera a bit closer. Okay. So how about now? Can you hear me better now? Any feedback? Can you hear me, guys?
Yeah, we're getting on.
They can hear me. Okay, cool. So the puzzle of epistemic blame is basically a conjunction of three claims that together lead into a contradiction. The first claim is that we are sometimes blameworthy in a distinctively epistemic way. So this premise seems to just state the possibility of epistemic blame. Then the second premise, all blame is ultimately moral. And the third premise, if all blame is moral, then we are never blameworthy in a distinctively epistemic way. So I take it for granted that under some reading, and I won't spell it out more precisely in this presentation, the third claim is true. Then we have to somehow change premises 1 or 2 or reject one of them. So we reject premise 1 or claim 1, then it seems like we lose the epistemic side of things out of the picture. And if we reject premise 2 or claim 2, then we seem to lose the moral side of things out of the picture. So this seems to be a kind of a so I think in general there are two approaches to spelling out the notion of epistemic blame. The first is, I think, and that's a more familiar strategy in the literature. We start with some account of moral blame, and then we move away from this account and spell out an epistemic analog to this moral blame. And the second approach is that we define paradigmatic epistemic norms. So we think that maybe epistemic norms require us to fit our beliefs to our evidence or something, and then see which form of blame is appropriate in response to violation of these norms. So I think these are two approaches. So the first starts with moral accounts of blame or accounts of moral blame, and the second starts with notion of epistemic norms. Let me just say a bit more about these approaches. So this is the first one. We start with moral blame, move away from it, and spell out an epistemic analog. Sorry?
Sorry, Sebastian.
Something not working? Or?
What is it saying?
It's not clearly known.
Somewhat?
It is sound isn't clearly known.
Oh, it isn't clear enough. So,
Okay,
maybe I just have to try to speak very clearly.
Perhaps, I think if you slow down a bit, right?
Okay, yeah. So I think this approach has some advantages. So the first advantage is that we have some kind of orientation, because we can look at these accounts of moral blame and then apply them to the epistemic domain. So we have some kind of place to start from. Second, we might capture what is distinctively epistemic about epistemic blame, because we aim specifically at spelling out the epistemic analog by looking at the moral accounts and then moving away from them to the epistemic domain. Right? But I think also this has some problems. So the first problem is that we will have trouble convincing everyone that the epistemic thing that comes out of our account in the end is still blame, because we're moving away from the moral domain. So we will have trouble convincing everyone that we're still talking about blame. And the other problem is that we might overlook the role of morality in our epistemic lives because we focus specifically on the epistemic dimension, and then might not capture the moral dimension of our epistemic lives. So the other approach, and that's the one I will try today, is to define paradigmatic epistemic norms, like, well, we ought to fit our beliefs in our evidence, believe only what is supported sufficiently by evidence, and don't believe what is insufficiently supported by evidence, something like that. And then see which form of blame is appropriate in response to violating these paradigmatic norms. So this has some advantages again. We won't have trouble convincing everyone that we're talking about blame, because from the beginning we try to look at paradigmatic responses of blame in response to violating epistemic norms. And second, we could discover that moral blaming responses, maybe like something like resentment or indignation or whatever you think are paradigmatic blaming responses, are sometimes appropriate in response to violations of epistemic norms. Some people explicitly deny this from the start. They say that responses like resentment and indignation seem to be out of the place in the epistemic domain. That's something I want to doubt today. But of course, this approach also has problems. First, we have to start with a preconception of epistemic norms, so we have to assume something what paradigmatic epistemic norms are. Second, we might overlook the distinctly epistemic side of epistemic blame because we're focusing on paradigmatic cases of blame, which are maybe moral. So both approaches have some problems, and no matter where we start, so whether we take the moral blaming responses or epistemic norms as our starting point, there seem to be several issues that arise for any methodology in theorizing about epistemic blame. So first, we have to make substantial assumptions either about moral blame, or should I use it? Okay. So sorry, I'm just trying to go on. What is this? Okay. Can you hear me? Some feedback from the audience?
Yes.
Yeah?
Yes.
I
think we can hear you.
So hopefully it's better now. So there are these problems no matter where we start from. The first, we have to make substantial assumptions either about blame or about epistemic norms, depending on which approach we choose here. We will either lose the epistemic dimension or the moral dimension of our cognitive lives out of sight, so at least that's the danger. No matter which approach we choose, either of these things seems to be in risk of being lost out of sight. And then we will either fail to convince everyone that what we talk about is really blaming. We try to spell out this thing to be epistemic notion, or we fail to convince everyone that what we talk about is really epistemic if we focus too much on the paradigmatic blaming responses. So my proposed solution here is that let's just take both approaches. So we're not restricted to just taking one. Let's just take both and see when they need us. I think that's maybe the most reasonable, or maybe also the only reasonable option that we have in theorizing. So I think we can look for blame that is distinctly epistemic, and we can also discuss which kinds of responses are appropriate in response to violations of epistemic norms. And maybe if we do both of these methodological directions, we get a nice count of epistemic blame. But what I will do today is like to take one of these approaches, so the dominant approach in the literature, just to look at moral blame, and then spell out a distinctly epistemic analog. And today I try the other way around. So I discuss what kinds of blaming responses are appropriate in response to violations, in response to violating distinctly epistemic norms. And we will see that paradigmatic moral responses can be appropriate. So moral responses can count as epistemic blame. And this is moralizing epistemic blame. So what's the point of that? Of moralizing epistemic blame? I think in the theory of epistemic blame, we can show that epistemic blame is a kind of genuine blame because nobody doubts that moral blaming responses are blaming responses. So we have a good argument that there's really something like epistemic blame there. In the theory of epistemic normativity, we might have some hope to show that epistemic norms sometimes have a normative significance of moral duties, because the same kind of responses are appropriate when we violate moral duties on the one hand and epistemic norms on the other hand. And sometimes they have a similar significance for our lives. And in the theory of reasons for belief, I think we can show that we don't need something like practical reasons for belief to explain the moral dimension of our cognitive life, like, for example, phenomena like necessity wronging. But maybe we still do need something like pragmatic encroachment and epistemic rationality. So I will stay neutral on this here, but at least we don't need to assume that there's a separate practical dimension of belief to make sense of moral dimensions of cognitive life. And generally for our lives, well, it allows us to properly acknowledge the force of epistemic normativity as often being analogous to the force of morality. So if the same kind of responses are appropriate in response to violating epistemic norms as they are appropriate in response to violating moral duties, then these have a similar normative force for our lives, basically. Okay, so that's the project. What I'm going to do now is I will isolate the epistemic norm violation first. That's like a challenge, right? To say that, okay, in this case, we only violate an epistemic norm and not also a moral norm. And I will focus on non-cultural beliefs for that purpose. And then I defend the project of moralization. I would say that non-culpable beliefs can still be blameworthy. I will make this distinction between blameworthiness and non-culpability. Blameworthiness and culpability. And finally, I discuss the implications for epistemology. So I will just show what moralized epistemic blame means for epistemology. Okay, so what are non-culpable beliefs? So here's a definition. A belief being of a person as non-culpable if and only if this person did not possess decisive practical reasons to engage in practices of doxastic self-management. And by that I mean actions and omissions with foreseeable effects on beliefs that probably would have led the person to not holding this belief. So the basic idea is a belief is non-culpable if a person had no duty to avoid it, if the person was allowed to let this belief develop and not to intervene in the process of this development of the belief. So decisive practical reasons here means a duty. So the person did not have a duty to engage in these practices of messing around with their own doxastic life. And I mean, this holds for most rational beliefs, morally beneficial beliefs, reflectively formed beliefs, and spontaneous beliefs, because in all these cases, either we did already a lot to get good beliefs that we acquired and then became more rational, or they were somehow helpful for us. We just invested a lot of time and then we fulfilled our doxastic duties of managing our mental life. And also spontaneous beliefs, by that I mean like beliefs that come about when I move around in the world. So I just walk around and I acquire the belief that there's a tree, then there was nothing I should have done to avoid that. It would be very weird to try avoiding such perceptual beliefs. So non-culpable beliefs are most of our beliefs. But then what's also interesting is I think that a lot of implicit bias beliefs and morally problematic beliefs can fall into this category. So if these beliefs just come about during our education, our socialization, normally until a certain age, there's nothing you could really do to avoid having these beliefs that your society implants into you. I will give a few examples. I think first, these beliefs can be subjectively non-culpable, so from the agent's informed perspective. So given the agent's perspective, the agent had no duty to get rid of certain implicit biases or other morally problematic beliefs. And secondly, they might also be, in certain cases, objectively non-culpable. So even if we abstract from the agent's perspective, so we might conceive of a case where a person would really be excluded from their moral community or from their community in general if they get rid of these biases, if they question their own worldview that they were educated with. And this is a high sort of cost to be excluded from the society. So I think even as like someone who gives an external advice to the person, it would sometimes be too much to say like, yeah, you should question all your belief system and get out of this community as quickly as you can. At a certain age, maybe that's the right response, but up to a certain age, I don't think it is. And so here are just some examples for non-culpable beliefs that I will be focusing on. The first example is John. John grew up in a community of climate change deniers. So that's like denying climate change is one of the beliefs we regard to be morally problematic. John only gets accepted in his community if he dogmatically disregards scientific evidence for climate change. Since the personal costs for John are high, his practical reasons favor remaining dogmatic. So at least up to a certain age, it's like you shouldn't do anything to become undogmatic because that would exclude him from this community. However, this doesn't change the fact that his epistemic reasons favor believing in climate change. I think that's important to fix this, that his epistemic reasons, at least in the case how I want to understand the case, they still favor believing in climate change. And we can do this with other morally problematic beliefs, like racist or sexist beliefs. Here this is an analog case just with racist and sexist beliefs, and the person would be excluded if they would question these implicit biases and attitudes that they adopted due to being raised in this way. And so there would be these high social costs if they start to question their own worldview in the society. And still, this doesn't change the fact that the epistemic reasons disfavor here the racist or sexist beliefs. So how do these beliefs help us to isolate what is distinctively epistemic here? So I think in both cases, John does not commit any blameworthy mistake when it comes to how he responds to his moral or practical reasons. So in order to psychologically survive within his dogmatic communities, not to be excluded and so on, it is practically reasonable for him to remain a dogmatic climate change denier or a sexist or racist. But still, I think this does not imply that John is blameless. So although his beliefs are non-culpable, in the sense I defined it, they violate distinctively epistemic norms. So he is dogmatic and disregards evidence that is possessed by him or available to him. So there's this conflict between what is practically permissible for him, but on the other hand, what is epistemically forbidden for him. So if John is blameworthy, then his blameworthiness is epistemic. Because morally he's not doing anything wrong. So he's violating epistemic norm, but not practical. The cases are also promising for like my project of moralizing epistemic blame, because the cases have moral significance without involving a moral norm violation, but only epistemic norm violation. Okay, so here's just another case from the literature to just illustrate this a bit. It's quite famous in the discussion. So from Schmidt, she contrasts two individuals, Abigail and Bert. And while Abigail adopted a racist ideology through growing up in a racist environment, Bert grew up in a tolerant family, but then later reflectively endorsed racist attitudes. And so Smith says that understanding the circumstances in which a person's evaluative tendencies or beliefs were formed may have a very important influence on the kind or degree of moral criticism we think appropriate to make. So we can appreciate how difficult it might be for Abigail to come to recognize the viciousness of her own evaluative judgments, given their early entrenchment in her psyche, and also how difficult it might be for her to modify these judgments once their viciousness is recognized. So for this reason, we are likely to be less critical of Abigail than we are of Bert, who adopted his racist intolerant commitments in a fully reflective way after being exposed to the morally appropriate values of tolerance and inclusiveness. So what does Smith say in this case? Basically, he says that Abigail is less blameworthy than Bert because she was raised in this way and did not reflectively endorse these attitudes. But she's still blameworthy, and that's important. Although her attitudes are non-culpable in my sense of it, she couldn't really get rid of them because they were just part of her socialization. So I agree with that. But if Abigail is blameworthy, she must have violated some norm, right? So there must be some kind of mistake that you can attribute to her for this blameworthiness. And my own view that I defend in this forthcoming paper is that she violates norms in holding her attitudes, even if she doesn't violate norms in performing her actions. So there's just this thinking between the norms that govern our attitudes and the norms that govern our actions, and she's violating the former, but not that. That's grounds blameworthiness. While Bert is violating both of them. That's why he's more blameworthy. So tragically, Abigail might only perform actions that were permissible, but still end up having attitudes for which she's blameworthy. I mean, that's tragic, but it happens. So sometimes such blameworthiness is grounded in the violation of epistemic norms of belief. So it's a kind of epistemic wronging, I'd like to call it. Okay, so what seems uncontroversial in this case is that it's appropriate to modify one's attitudes towards Abigail because of the racist beliefs due to her racism, especially if one is a potential target of her racism. But what is controversial is that whether this relationship modification can count as appropriate blame. So maybe it's just a strategic way to deal with a person who is like dangerous, but maybe we can't really blame her for it because she was raised in this way, right? So that would be a possible view you could take on this case. But my argument is that it can be a form of blame because the practice of apology and forgiveness is intelligible, and that will be the argument that I spell out now a bit more clearly in a second. part of the talk, it makes sense for everybody to apologize to her victims, and they in turn can intelligently forgive her, postpone forgiveness, or deny forgiveness. How am I in time? How many?
Yeah, we wasted a lot of time with them, so it's not 10 minutes, but I'm sure you can more. So.
Yeah, so 15 minutes, 20, that's great. That's great. Okay, so now I argue that these non-culpable beliefs can actually be blameworthy. So I defend this view and my own view. The basic idea is that we look at our practice of apology and forgiveness and carve out our implicit commitments within this practice about blameworthiness and responsibility. So here's a short version of the argument. I will say that if you owe an authentic apology to someone for your non-culpable behavior B, large B, that was capital B, that was caused by your non-culpable beliefs, lower b, then you are blameworthy not only for your behavior, but also for your beliefs. So we'll focus on the harmful behavior that is caused by these beliefs, and then argue that since you're blameworthy for this behavior, you must also be blameworthy for the underlying belief. So that's the basic version of the argument. So in the case of John that I presented, assume that his unjustified beliefs, whatever they were, like climate change denial or sexist belief or racist belief, they lead to harmful or risky behavior. So that's what we're assuming. I mean, you can assume all kinds of things of how these attitudes lead to a problematic behavior. And the intuition is that an apology is appropriate in this case. And we see that if we contrast it with excuses like I was just raised to be like that. But John could say something, I was just raised to be like that, and we wouldn't really accept this because I mean he should take responsibility in some way for his problematic beliefs. The problem here is that we can sometimes, the problem with my argument is that we can sometimes appropriately apologize for things without being blameworthy for anything. So there are these cases of what I call conventional apologies. So sometimes we just open a door, and then we hit someone by opening the door, and we say, I'm sorry, but we just open the door with a normal amount of care. And so we're not really blameworthy for that, but we still apologize, right? Or we sit down next to someone in public transport and we accidentally touch the person, and we say, oh, I'm sorry, just to communicate that what we did was not intentional. And in these cases, obviously we're not blameworthy, but still we apologize. So how do I solve this problem? So I distinguish between conventional apologies and authentic apologies. And I say for these conventional apologies, you're not actually blameworthy, but you are blameworthy for these authentic apologies. And so how do I make a difference? I focus on our practice of forgiveness. So with the conventional apologies, the practice of forgiveness is unintelligible, but with the authentic apologies, this practice is actually intelligible. By the practice of forgiveness, I mean like, well, someone does harm to you, they apologize, and then it's somehow up to you whether you want to like forgive them or postpone forgiveness or deny forgiveness. These are all like intelligible use cases of authentic apologies. So just come back to the conventional apologies. In the case where you open the door and you hit someone with the door, to say something like "I forgive you" is the best joke, right? So if you hit the person and you apologize, "Oh, I'm sorry," the other person says, "Yeah, I forgive you." If they know that you're blameless, they cannot forgive you because there's nothing to forgive you. You're just blameless. Or it would also be unintelligible if the person apologizes to you, they just hit you with the door, they apologize, and you refuse to forgive them. And that's just pointless because they are not blameworthy. It would also make no sense to say something like, I need some time before I can forgive you. So like postponing forgiveness doesn't make any sense in these conventional cases where no one is really blameworthy. So with John and Abigail, these reactions do have a point. That's the important thing, right? Forgiving, postponing forgiveness, and refusing to forgive is an intelligible move here. So it doesn't mean that all of these moves are justified or appropriate, but each of these moves is at least intelligible because they are, and I think this shows that they are really blameworthy. If this person, the racist or sexist person, harms you with their racist or sexist behavior, and at some point they realize, oh, they did something wrong to you, they apologize, and in some sense it's up to you to forgive them, to postpone forgiveness, or to deny forgiveness. That seems like a very strong intuition. So in these cases, this just shows that these cases are different from the conventional apology cases. They are more like the authentic apology cases, where someone really wrongs you and is blameworthy. So this is why I think that the apology that is required by John and Abigail, if they harm someone, as a result of holding racist or sexist beliefs. It's not very conventional, but it's authentic, so they must acknowledge their own blameworthiness by apologizing. Okay, and there are some objections to this. So there's the worry, like, does this intelligibility really imply blameworthiness? And there are potential counterexamples. One is by Bernard Williams, the other by Julius Driver, but I think I will just skip them for now because it takes up at least a few minutes to discuss them. And we can come back to this in the discussion if you have any worries with my argument at this point. Yeah, so I just skip this slide. Okay, so what I've established now is that John owes the people he harmed an authentic apology, so he has to acknowledge his blameworthiness for his non-culpable behavior. Now, the last step in the argument is that if he's blameworthy for this behavior, then he's also blameworthy for his underlying attitude or for his underlying belief. And we can just show this by ruling out other possible explanations. So you could say that, well, maybe what he's really blameworthy for are the actions in the past that led to the attitude or the behavior or the belief. But this was just ruled out by the description of the case, right? So we assumed basically that the belief he holds and as well as the behavior he shows is non-culpable because he was just raised in this way. So maybe we can just strike out this first possible alternative explanation. The other explanation would be like, well, maybe he is blameworthy for the non-culpable behavior itself because that's like an overt action, right? But not for the underlying attitude. Sorry, I read attitude. I thought I fixed this. It should say belief here. It doesn't matter. So he's only blameworthy for the behavior, but not the underlying belief. The problem with this is that John managed the behavior to the best of his abilities. We can at least assume this, right? So he was raised in this environment, and then a lot of the behavior he shows seems rational from his perspective. So that we can assume that he made an effort to be a decent human being, but he just failed, right? So so he managed the behavior to the best of his abilities, but he failed being a decent human being, so to say. And if he's blameworthy for the non-culpable behavior, then why shouldn't he also be blameworthy for the non-culpable belief? It's just not clear what theoretical resources you have to say that you have left if you say that, yeah, we agree that he's blameworthy for the behavior, but not for the belief. I mean, why should this be? If both is not culpable, then you can as well also be blameworthy for belief. I don't see the reason to deny that. So I think we can also cross out that possible explanation. And what is left then is that his attitudes or belief are plausible loci of his blameworthiness, or where his blameworthiness comes from is his problematic belief. So there are reasons responsive states, so they open the room for something like criticism and blame. If you have these states that are not well supported by reasons, then you can be criticized or blamed, and they can manifest biases. So if you're dogmatic, you hold a lot of beliefs, even though you have evidence against them, and these beliefs manifest this bias of dogmatism. Right? So these two facts show that attitudes or beliefs are good locus of saying that this is where your blameworthiness comes from, basically. So what I conclude is that blameworthiness for non-culpable behavior that was caused by non-culpable belief or attitude implies blameworthiness for this belief or attitude. So that's basically the argument. Here's a brief summary just to get you back on track. We sometimes owe an authentic apology for non-culpable behavior that was caused by non-culpable belief. Authentic apologies, as contrasted with conventional ones, imply blameworthiness for what one apologizes for. This difference to conventional apology is revealed in the full intelligibility of our practice of forgiveness. So if we are blameworthy for non-culpable behavior, then we should accept that we are also blameworthy for the non-culpable beliefs that cause this behavior. And this practice might need some fundamental revision. So some people like Nussbaum, like Martin Nussbaum, she argues that our practice of anger and forgiveness is just totally flawed and we should revise that. But this would require normative arguments for why this practice of holding each other responsible for non-culpable beliefs in this case is harmful or something like that. I tend to think it's a useful practice because I think it allows us to deal with non-culpable wrongdoing. But yeah, you might give these normative arguments and I haven't argued against them in this presentation. So, but at least this would be a very new debate that we don't have right now about in the discussions about blameworthiness and responsibility. Okay, so this is the second part, and I now argue that we are blameworthy for these non-culpable beliefs. And I think this now leads us to something like moralized epistemic blame. So let me explain. Where do we stand? So our practice of apology and forgiveness implies that we are sometimes genuinely blameworthy for non-culpable beliefs. So I think this allows us to capture our intuitive ambiguity when we evaluate the non-culpable beliefs that people just adopted by being raised in a certain environment, but still they are morally problematic. Because we can distinguish between practical reasons for belief management and epistemic reasons. So we can say that if you hold a non-culpable belief, of the kind that I was focusing on, you responded correctly to your practical reasons for belief management. So your belief management is not what we can blame you for. In this regard, you are blameless. But you might still have failed to respond correctly to your epistemic reasons for belief. And in this regard, you are blameless. Even if you did no mistake in managing your belief might still be unjustified from its epistemic perspective. And this is where your blameworthiness comes from. So plausibly, you are blameworthy for a non-culpable belief in virtue of that latter epistemic mistake. So what does it show about epistemic blame and epistemic normativity? I think first it shows that epistemic blame, so the kind of response, that's the definition, that is appropriate when people violate distinctively epistemic norms, is genuine blame. It can be like paradigmatic moral blame. That's just because it is involved in this practice of apology and forgiveness, which is paradigmatically a moral practice. So no matter what you think paradigmatic moral blame is, if this practice is appropriate, the kinds of moral responses are appropriate as well. So apology and forgiveness is distinctively moral, and it does not just involve reducing what's epistemic trust or desiring that we have not believed badly, as these newer accounts of epistemic blame say, what is the essence of epistemic blame. But it could be something stronger, something that undeniably is a form of genuine blame. So instead, some mistake has been committed for which serious amends are called. So people have to apologize for this mistake, but sometimes they have to be, maybe can be forgiven or not forgiven. And due to this moral significance of the case, passionate responses like resentment, indignations, and feelings of guilt do not seem to be fully out of place. And second, violating distinctively epistemic norms sometimes has the same kind of normative significance as violating moral duties. What do I mean by that? I basically mean that reactive attitudes like resentment or indignation, for example, they reveal the normative significance that we take a norm violation to have. So basically, if someone wrongs us and we react with resentment, or someone else observes the situation and reacts with indignation, then this shows that we care about the violation of a moral norm. So resentment and indignation indicate the way we care about the norm violation at issue. Genuine norms are linked to blameworthiness in some way. So if you talk about genuine normativity, then we have to assume that we are, in normal cases, blameworthy for violating these norms. And so, yeah, I think it shows basically that epistemic norms can have this genuine normativity. So third, I think it shows that we can wrong each other merely by committing an epistemic mistake. So we didn't commit any other blameworthy mistake, but only an epistemic mistake. And I think this shows something like the possibility of epistemic wronging. So not all obsessive wronging is like a moral wrong, but it can be, the reason for this wrong can be the violation of an epistemic norm. And I think this is neutral with regard to the nature of epistemic wronging. So maybe we have to appeal to something like pragmatic encroachment to explain the possibility of this epistemic wronging, but I will stay neutral on this here. So at the very least, we do not have to appeal to a distinctively practical kind of belief normativity to explain how we can wrong each other with beliefs. So we don't have to assume that there's epistemic normativity of belief, and only epistemic responses are appropriate when we violate these norms, and the practical normativity of belief that only moral responses are appropriate when we violate these moral norms. But we can say that the epistemic domain is enough to explain whether there are moral dimensions to our beliefs. Okay, now one final point. This is like really very vague, and I think it's not established by anything I said, but I think it's, at least what I said gives some support to this position, hopefully. I think we owe it to each other in some way that we are epistemically rational, that we comply with epistemic norms. So epistemic norms are duties towards fellow epistemic citizens. They don't derive from the nature of rationality or the aim of belief, but they derive from our epistemic communities and our relationships that we have there. I think that's at least an approach I sympathize with, and I think that's somehow supported by what I said. So there are some objections to this, especially in this new paper by Theo Varchi, if I pronounce his name correctly, or if I don't. When blaming the student for affirming the consequent, he writes, so this is not a direct quote, but he writes something like this: I do not think that they owe it to me that they don't affirm the consequence. So if someone does a logical mistake, it doesn't seem like they owe it to me that they don't make this consequence. So what, that they don't make this mistake and affirm the consequence. So what will reply to that? Well, I think they owe it to the epistemic community that they can only be reasoned with properly if they care about being rational. So in this sense, they owe it to the epistemic community. And I think, as a side note, I don't think that affirming the consequence is always irrational. I think it's only irrational if you have some training in logic and stuff. Then he also writes that we don't apologize for being epistemically blameworthy. We don't feel guilty about being epistemically blameworthy, and we don't feel the need to confess our epistemic mistakes. Like in reply to that, I think my cases of non-culpable blameworthy belief are counterexamples. So I think we sometimes owe it to other people that we like confess to them. Also, sorry, I thought so badly about you in the past. I was such a bad person. I'm making an effort to be a better person, and I think this is something that makes sense. These kinds of confessions. And finally, he says any compulsion that we feel to comply with epistemic norms needs to come from our faculty of reasons, not from our agents. But I also think, like, okay, in my cases, because there are these paradigmatic moral responses appropriate, I think that's just, these are just counterexamples against this view. Okay, so let's come to the conclusion. How do we solve this problem of epistemic blame? I basically think that there are two solutions we now have open. So solution A is to say that, we are sometimes epistemically blameworthy, even though we are not blameworthy in a distinctively epistemic way. And epistemic blame is itself also like a form of moral blame, or it's very much like moral blame. It's also moral, it's the vague sense that I use it. So this solution has the advantage that that we can make sense of the idea that there's something like genuine epistemic blame. We don't have to reject premise 2. We can just accept that epistemic blame is itself a form of moral blame, and the only kind of blaming response that we allow to be moral blame count as genuine blame. That's like an implication of the solution. So everything else, which is just something like epistemic criticism, would not be like real blame. So all these other forms of epistemic blame that were spelled out in the literature, like losing epistemic trust, they would not count as real blame, but just in the form of criticizing each other for things. So I personally don't endorse the solution actually, but I think it's good to have it because some people would doubt that reducing epistemic trust and these other weaker forms of blame are genuine blame. So I prefer solution B. There is sometimes like also a distinctively epistemic blameworthiness, and so we have to cross out 2 and say that, well, some epistemic blame is moral, like the moral blames forms of blame that I have argued for, but other epistemic blame might not be moral, so like the reducing trust blame. Some people might doubt premise 1 by saying that reducing epistemic trust is not genuine blame, but then the first solution that I just showed, that epistemic blame is just moral blame, or like moral blame, is still available for defending the possibility of epistemic blame. So I think it's good to have these 2 solutions to be dialectically convincing and convince people that, look, there is something like real epistemic blame. Yeah, thank you for your attention.
I think we're going to have to regroup. So, Sebastian, do you want to come back here?
Yes, sure.
Are we going to keep the mic on?
We're going to have to turn the mic on.
What should I do with the mic that I have?
I think just put it. Are we keeping the mic?
Yeah.
Okay. Share on Zoom. Kevin, do you want to know who's listening to you?
They've just put down their hands. Did you catch who's first?
Sorry, can you speak?
No, I didn't catch who's first. Could you all raise your hands if you have a question, please?
So we have to produce that Michael Polymers first. Go for it, Michael.
I'm sure you hear us.
Michael, I think you need to unmute yourself.
Okay, no, we really don't hear you that well. But I heard my name, so I just start. Thank you, Sebastian, for the nice talk. I have two questions, one more explorative, the other more critical. The first one would be whether this account of epistemic blame generalizes to all other kinds of attitudes, right? Whether there will be resentment blame, for instance, where yeah, I guess it's obvious what I mean, right? As soon as there are attitudes involved, which have their own kind of reasons, whether there will be a corresponding form of blame. And the second one is, I think at the end, you used the expression, we owe it to each other to be epistemically rational. And there, I'm not sure whether that was just an expression you used because we use such expressions, or whether you really literally meant it. Because if you really literally mean that we owe it to each other, then we have a duty, and I guess we will always be culpable in not, there won't be any cases of non-culpable beliefs then, right? Because there will always be a decisive practical reason to attend to your epistemic reasons properly. Yeah, maybe that was just an imprecision on your part.
Yeah, thank you so much. I like both points very much. The first is, I think I just agree. Yeah. So an implication of this would be for every attitude where you have your own kinds of right kind of reasons or something like that. There will be a specific kind of blame, but then it's not like I have 1,000 different forms of blame, because actually they might just turn out to be all about the same form of blame, because they're all like moral blame ultimately, right? But they are grounded in different violations of different norms, basically. So I think this is the right direction, and we can make sense of blameworthiness for having intentions, for having desires, for having different kinds of emotions, and so on. And I think that's a nice implication of what I'm saying. So yeah, thanks for pointing that out. And the second one, I see it. So you said that basically if we owe it to each other to be rational, then we always have a duty to be rational, and so we will always be culpable for being irrational or for violating epistemic norms, right? I think this depends a bit on what culpability means, because I think I have quite a technical notion of it, probably, the definition that I give. And I think you're right that we would always be blameworthy, at least in the absence of excuses or exemptions, for being irrational or for violating epistemic norms. But I don't think it always needs to be culpable, because it can just happen that you fulfill all your duties of belief management and then still end up having an irrational belief or belief that violates an epistemic norm. And this belief would then be non-culpable, but you might still be blameworthy for this norm violation. Yeah, does that make sense?